Welcome, everybody. Thanks, everybody, for coming out. My name is Emmett Byrne, and I'm the Design Director and Associate Curator of Design here at the Walker Art Center. Thanks to everybody for coming. I think tonight's event is going to be amazing. And I just have a few announcements that I'd like to make before I introduce the speaker. So first up, I just want to say a little bit about the Insights Design Lecture Series. The series has been in existence for over 35 years now, and it's a collaboration between the Walker Art Center and AIGA Minnesota. And I'd like to thank my amazing colleagues at the AIGA, especially Brent Stickles, who has been our liaison for many years, and it has been such a pleasure working with Brent, and also Matt Lowe. AIGA Minnesota works super hard to bring great design to the Twin Cities, so please check them out at aigaminnesota.org to see everything that they've got going on. I'd also like to quickly thank Shapco Printing, who donated the printing of this year's poster. Shapco has been an amazing partner to the Walker for many years as well. And finally, I'd like to thank Vance Wallenstein and Eric Timothy Carlson for the design of this year's poster. A little bit about tonight's event. Danielle will give a presentation, and then at the end, we're going to have a Q&A session. So please stick around. And it's as simple as, if you have a question, please unmute your mic and ask your question. Otherwise, you can drop a question in the chat, and I'll be looking for those, and I'll direct those to Danielle if we have those as well. So now for tonight's speaker. Danielle Aubert is a designer of many talents. She is a researcher, a writer, a teacher, a performer, and of course, a maker. And at the core of her practice is the idea of questioning the systems that we exist within, especially as designers, by examining the materials we use, the methods of production that dictate the boundaries of our expression, the machines that empower our work, and the culture of labor. Before moving to Detroit, where she currently lives, Danielle earned her BA in English Literature from the University of Virginia and an MFA in Graphic Design from Yale University, having practiced design in both New York and Moscow. From 2013 to 2015, she was a fellow in the Creative and Performing Arts at the Lewis Center for the Arts at Princeton University. She is the author of several books, including the Detroit Printing CoOp, The Politics of the Joy of Printing, which you'll hear about tonight, as well as the co-author of Thanks for the View, Mr. Mies. Danielle runs an independent design practice with clients such as Harvard Graduate School of Design, the Cranbrook Art Museum, and the Museum of Contemporary Art Detroit. And when she's not managing all of that, she is also the president of the AAUP-AFT Local 6075 that represents the staff of Wayne State University, where she is a professor of graphic design. Her work has been recognized in the Brno Biennial, the AIGA 50/50 book competition, the Type Directors Club Tokyo, and shown at the School of Art Institute of Chicago, the Palais de Tokyo in Paris, and Motto in Berlin. So I am super excited to hear what she has to say tonight. Without further ado, Danielle Aubert.
Thank you. That was very nice. So yes, hello everyone. I'm excited to be able to speak as part of this series, and that was just Bauhaus, a Bauhaus track, and the first slide. It's a song, All We Ever Wanted Was Everything, which seemed sort of appropriate for what I was going to talk about tonight. So thank you for the introduction, Emmett, and obviously, I would have really liked to be able to be in Minneapolis right now, but I'm also, happy to do this on Zoom. And I was realizing that this week marks the second anniversary of the start of lockdown. And we're in such a different place than we were 2 years ago, generally, but also with respect to online Zoom lectures, I think, like what we expect of them and also what we expect of ourselves when we listen to them. So I just want to acknowledge it's the end of the workday. We all have busy lives. I want to give everybody permission to half pay attention or fully pay attention. And however you're here, it's great. I know I do a lot of chores while I'm watching Zoom things on Zoom. But also, please feel free to use the chat function to message each other or message me about whatever. Emmett is actually going to be looking at the chat. But so tonight, I'm going to talk about labor, unions, and my own practice as a graphic designer and an educator. And then at the end, there'll be some time for discussion, hopefully. So first, before I begin, I just wanted to congratulate the Walker Worker Union for ratifying their first contract last October. So it's a huge lift, but now a whole new set of work is going to begin, like enforcing the contract and building and maintaining solidarity. But hopefully you all can rest a bit. It's a tremendous achievement to start a union from nothing. So just to talk a bit about my own kind of experience as a graphic designer, when I was starting out, I was very aware of the limits and potential of my own agency as a worker. To be specific, I did not feel like I had much agency. Like as a junior designer, I didn't have a say in what I was designing for clients. I would use the words, images, typefaces that were provided to me. But at the same time, even though I didn't feel that way, I did have power because I was the one making things. But this gets kind of to the root of the power of labor. You feel powerless because you're a cog in the machine, and you feel easily replaceable. But at the same time, you do have a lot of power precisely because without you, the machine doesn't work. So questions around power and agency have motivated me for a long time. How can we claim power as graphic designers? I learned early on that the more I could find ways to direct my own work, the better. And that often meant creating work outside of normal working hours to set things up so that at the next stage of my working career, I could have a few more options. I'm going to talk about a couple of projects that come at the question of labor and graphic design from different angles. In 2019, I published a book on the Detroit Printing Co-op, which existed from 1970 to 1980. This was a space in Detroit that a group of people set up with printing equipment that they made available to anyone who wished to use it at no charge. They just asked that people include this union label on anything that was printed there to indicate that they belong to the industrial workers of the world. The IWW is a revolutionary industrial union. It's different from trade unions in that they call for the total abolition of the wage system, the abolition of the state here. The IWW organizes all workers into one big union. The idea being that trade unionism, where workers are divided according to the kind of work they do, is counterproductive to building true worker solidarity and worker power. Two of the main founders of the co-op were Freddie and Lorraine Perlman. Together with a set of friends, they borrowed money in order to get set up, and they took on paid printing jobs, mostly from other leftist groups, in order to pay off their debts. Their expenses included things like rent, utilities, materials, but pretty much anyone who wanted to could go in and use the printing equipment. The co-op was not a big operation, but it had an outsized impact. They printed tens of thousands of copies of books, flyers, posters, and pamphlets there, including some really key texts, like the first English translation of Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle. Freddie Perlman had a PhD in economics, but he's best known for his writings on Marx and anarcho-primitivism, and took an interest in craft, printing, and design. And sometimes I think of these three copies of Freddie Perlman's essay, The Reproduction of Daily Life, as a visual example of what anarchist printing looks like. These are all the same edition. Their interior is the same layout. It was done on a typewriter, but for the cover, they used whatever paper and ink was available, and they were apparently unconcerned with matching the typeface on the cover. So each one is a little bit different, but it's all the same edition. Perlman taught himself to typeset and do color separations, and he took pleasure in working with image overlays and beautifying these political texts that he and Lorraine were publishing. Over time, the printing got more sophisticated, like his skills sort of got better, like here was doing type on a curve and overlaying different images. But the co-op was not just a place for printing. It was also, it was a place for printing, but it was also a site for the sharing and development of ideas. So people who would spend a lot of time there debated things like the pros and cons of trade unionism, for instance. They were also part of a network of other leftists and printers in Detroit that included Black Star, the printing arm of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. These were Black workers who started organizing in the Dodge Main Auto Factory in the late 1960s because Black workers were always having to do the worst, most dangerous jobs, like working in the foundry where it was extremely hot. They were also blocked from obtaining leadership positions within their union, the UAW. They started organizing as Black workers within the UAW, making the case that they had power and should have representation within the union, because if only the Black workers walked off the job, the entire auto factory would grind to a halt, precisely because their jobs were at key points of production. Members of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers used the equipment at the Detroit Printing Co-op to print books that promoted their ideas. This is a still from Finally Got the News document, or like a film that they made. And then this is a book that they printed at the co-op. In some of the other texts that Freddie Perlman wrote and printed at the co-op, he was very critical of the university as an institution. He had taught at Western Michigan University and basically hated it. He wrote about how the trustees of the universities are, quote, owners of capital who also control labor through factories and corporate workplaces. Perlman argued that the function of the university is to condition students to function smoothly within the capitalist apparatus. He argued that general education requirements for students, like gen ed requirements, are designed to extinguish a student's social power so that when they go into their last 2 years of classes, they're being trained to sell their labor on the market. Perlman also argued that, quote, by imposing the activities of capitalist society on students, the university is an instrument of colonialism. Like it's just reproducing, systems of oppression. So the book that I published a couple of years ago catalogs all the pamphlets, posters, and other materials that were printed at the co-op over the course of the 70s, and also the ways in which like the structure of the co-op itself impacted the way the design looks and the production decisions. So I'll also talk briefly about another project that relates to finding ways of operating within capitalism. So this is about a few years ago, I became very interested in Ursula K. Le Guin's book, The Dispossessed, which is a science fiction novel that tells the story of a physicist named Chevek who lives on a planet called Anaris, where there is no property. Le Guin gives a compelling description of what it might be like to live in a totally non-capitalist society, how work would be organized, how basic necessities would be distributed, what kind of art would exist there. And this book was originally published in 1974. This copy is like a later edition that I got, but over like a few years, I started accumulating used copies of the book. I liked the book a lot after I read it. And then whenever I would come across a copy, I would like buy it or keep it, or somebody would give it to me. I started to amass this collection. And then at a certain point, I started intentionally seeking out copies as part of a larger collection. And I was looking for copies that had marks in them left by past readers, or like marks of past ownership. So this has a mark here from a library. And then these have, underlines left by somebody who had read it. And after I collected 100 copies, I organized some group like used audiobook readings, basically getting people together to read copies of the books together, to create a kind of like a used audiobook experience of these underlined copies. So basically one person will read the text straight through, and other people start reading only when they reach an underlying portion of the text. So I'll play a sample of this now.
I don't understand, he said aloud. Someone answered him. For a while, he failed to comprehend. That was the person standing by his chair was speaking to him, answering him, for he no longer understood what an answer was. He was clearly aware of only one thing, his own total isolation. The world had fallen out from under him, and he was left alone.
No longer an individual.
He had always feared that this would happen, more than he had ever feared death.
To die is to lose the self and rejoin the rest.
He had kept himself and lost the rest.
He was able at last to look up at the man standing beside him. It was a stranger, of course. From now on, there would be only strangers. He was speaking in a foreign language.
Okay, so the idea is that you can kind of hear, where there's more interaction with the text by depending on how many people are reading. This is chapter 2, which was recorded in at a Labyrinth Books in Princeton, New Jersey.
Are we kept here by force? What force? What laws, governments, police? None. Simply our own being, our nature as Odonians. It's your nature to be Tyran, and my nature to be Shebek, and our common nature to be Odonians, responsible to one another. And that responsibility is our freedom. To avoid it would be to lose our freedom. Would you really like to live in a society where you had no responsibility and no freedom, no choice, only the false option of obedience to the law, or disobedience followed by punishment? Would you really want to go live in a prison?
So this sound weird, but I was interested in this idea of bringing together kind of a community of readers or a community of books, of people who would maybe like engage with this text, which was really meaningful to me. So I ended up doing 11 readings and making it through chapter 7. But at a certain point, I was in contact with Ursula K. Le Guin's literary agent, who said that I needed to stop doing this because it was violating copyright law. And then Ursula K. Le Guin herself sent me an email saying that I needed to stop because she didn't own the rights to the books. And Harper Collins would just send lawyers after me if I kept going. So this was obviously disappointing, but also kind of ironic because ownership is such an important theme within the book. And I'm sure I was not the first person to try to bootleg copies of The Dispossessed. And also I felt like I wanted to explain that this was not an audiobook anyone would listen to intentionally. Like it's not, it's sort of badly recorded. But anyway, I sort of stopped doing that after a while. But I undertook a second stage of this project where I scanned all of the spreads in all of the books that had marks in them and then removed the text and overlaid them one on top of another to kind of create this like buildup of all of the evidence of ownership of these like 100 copies of the book. So you could get a sense of past owners like libraries or bookstores. And then also within the text itself, you could get a sense of which passages elicited reactions from readers, sort of like readers talking back to the text. And then I assembled this all into a book. So it's like a blank book with mostly lines and marks and like comments and margins. But so as I was doing this research on the Detroit Printing Co-op and this, reading The Dispossessed, I was thinking a lot about how to move from this sort of abstract relationship to politics, like where I'm interested in, let's say, anarchism because of this novel, or with the Detroit Printing Co-op, I was reading a lot about political movements that were happening in Detroit in the 70s, but I wanted to try to make things more concrete by getting involved with things happening locally in Detroit. And so I started kind of going to a lot of meetings and like figuring out what was going on in the Detroit landscape, and became convinced, I'm still convinced, that in order to affect like mass change, you need mass movement in the streets. But also, more specifically, I wanted to think about how graphic design and then graphic designers as people or as a class can play a role in mass movement. And so one thing is that it's important for us as designers, as creative professionals, to recognize ourselves as workers. And one of the reasons that the labor movement has struggled is that we've been taught to believe that office workers or white collar workers are not really workers. We're like professionals, but we are workers when what we have to sell is our labor in exchange for wages. We're, basically workers. So as I was researching the co-op, I came across these two 1977 essays by Barbara and John Ehrenreich, who coined the term professional managerial class. So they were published in this journal, Radical America, but you can see at the bottom reference to that essay. And a lot of people have since questioned whether this term, the professional managerial class, is like a helpful term for thinking about class, but I find it kind of useful for thinking about designers specifically. They defined the professional managerial class, or the PMC, as, quote, salaried mental workers who do not own the means of production and whose major function in the social division of labor may be described broadly as the reproduction of capitalist culture and capitalist class relations. The PMC includes scientists, engineers, teachers, social workers, writers, accountants, lower and middle level managers, and administrators. And I would add to this list contemporary, like today, graphic designers, publishers. But at the time that they wrote this essay in 1977, there was like a notable increase in the labor market for this category of worker, for people who belong to the PMC. So the way they see it, the professional managerial class is in an antagonistic relationship with both the ruling classes and the working class. On the one hand, they don't have control over their lives. They sell their labor to the ruling class. On the other hand, their jobs are often to manage and manipulate members of the working class. For instance, administrators manage staff, or teachers manage students. But if you think about this idea of the PMC with relation to graphic designers, it could manifest in like art directors who manage teams of other people, or a UX designer who makes an app that helps reproduce existing culture and existing class relations. Like you design a new ride sharing app, and this kind of enables the gig economy to, to flourish. It reproduces social relationships. So this is an illustration from 1913, from an issue of the IWW newspaper, The Industrial Worker. But I feel like it's kind of helpful for thinking about labor. So here, the goose is supposed to be like a good worker who doesn't complain or go on strike. But if you imagine this goose to be a member of the PMC, it would be like someone who's like not only not going on strike for themselves, but they're also keeping a bunch of other people, like another flock of geese in the background, in check, thereby replicating systems of oppression. So the Ehrenreichs were optimistic about the radical potential for the professional managerial class. They could see that the PMC could gravitate either toward the ruling class or toward the working class. The PMC tends to be more liberal, more committed to social programs like universal education and healthcare and other kinds of social safety nets. They argued in their 1977 text that in order for revolutionary change to happen, the PMC would need to identify with the working class. They would need to recognize that, like, they're not free until everybody is free. So for graphic design, it's a little bit complicated because a lot of graphic designers like run studios. And so that's not quite the same thing as like what they're describing as the PMC. Like if you're a studio owner, you're more like a member of the small business owner class. That's what Marx would call the petit bourgeois. And small business owners overall, not talking about graphic design, but just like as an overall group of people, tend to be more conservative and identify with the ruling classes, like aspiring to become like millionaires or billionaires and be in a position where you can extract wealth from others. So, I've been sort of thinking about these ideas, and I don't know how useful it is, how like these categories even are, but it is kind of interesting to try to think about graphic design as a class. Like, what would it mean to organize graphic designers? And, there's been moves to decolonize design, to queer the profession, to make design more accessible. But there are limits to how much we can change so long as we're operating in a system that relies upon extraction of wealth from the working class. So I personally was motivated to think about the role of graphic design in contemporary politics by my own experience. As I was sort of looking around for what I could do in Detroit, I got involved with the Detroit chapter of the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America. And obviously I'm a graphic designer, so I ended up making a lot of like banners for Facebook and that type of thing. But then I also ended up on the steering committee. Like anytime you get involved with a volunteer organization, you can be quick to you get like promoted very quickly, like if you're willing to do any type of work. But during my time there, I made a bunch of things, but also there were some efforts to standardize the workflow for design, like to figure out who was going to work and how. But we kept falling back into patterns where things would happen kind of unofficially or at the last minute. And I was ambivalent about efforts to centralize the graphic design work in the chapter to committee, because I could see that, then we might end up just becoming more like an in-house design studio within the chapter that would exist to service the rest of the chapter. And I thought this would end up mimicking the way designers work in corporate settings. I thought it's better for designers to just be integrated into other work dealing with like housing justice or labor justice or climate justice, electoral politics or whatever, and then, make work where you needed to. But one of the, interesting things in the DSA was there was this kind of tension between professionalism and then like, non-designers, like people who didn't have professional experience, but they were just like interested in design. And some of the work made by non-designers was like totally amazing, clearly not corporate, but we'd like run into issues where people didn't necessarily know how to be a designer or how to work as a designer, how to take feedback. And then by default, like a handful of us would end up doing a lot of the work, mainly because we knew how to get things done quickly. So like this, these everyone tier 1 posters were some posters that I made for a friend, Sean Crawford, who worked at a General Motors plant in Flint, Michigan. And basically they had gone out on strike, and Sean was frustrated with the way negotiations were going between his union, the UAW, and GM, because he felt like they weren't addressing one of the major issues that existed within the factory, which was the problem of the tier system between workers. Like some workers were paid a lot more than other workers, depending on when they had come in to work at the factory. So he was like, he wanted to make these everyone tier 1 signs, and we got them made in like 2 days. Ocelot Print Shop printed them for free. And then we distributed them at the picket lines, and they ended up being really popular. But they kind of, it was this way in which we were like affecting a little bit, we were kind of going against the leadership of the union in a way, because they didn't really want to be talking about the tier system, where Sean Crawford, where the workers did. So over the last, I did a bunch of work for like 2-3 years and was thinking about like what it's like to be a designer working in these spaces. And then over the last couple of years, I started to work on a new project where I've been interviewing graphic designers who are also kind of leftists about their practices. So some of the designers I've spoken to so far are like Dakota Brown, who's done research on the International Typographical Union, Lauren Williams, who's done a lot of work with Black liberation movements in Detroit, Kevin Lowe, who's done work on anarchist movement politics in Montreal, and then Andy Pressman, who redesigned Dissent magazine, but also has done a lot of covers for Verso. And one of the things we talked about, or he talked about, was how for a long time there's been this reluctance from the left or socialist groups to really engage with graphic design, because it feels like once you start designing things look like a commodity, and it becomes like it's like you're creating consumerist objects. And then if something is too designed, it's like you can't trust it. I also talked to Kiko Paradella, who's a friend of mine from Detroit, who designed the identity for Means TV, which is like a streaming service described as Netflix for the left. And Means is itself also a worker co-op. And then I talked to Annika Bastaki, who's did a lot of strike support work for the 2019 UTLA teacher strike in Los Angeles. So I think one of the things that a lot of designers grapple with is how can you actually have a more liberatory practice if you want to? Like, we understand we're replicating systems of oppression maybe, but like, how do we not do that? What can you do? We all have jobs and we have to kind of work with what we have. So I've taught since 2008 at Wayne State in Detroit. This is the building I teach in, but it's taken me a long time to really feel present there. But that's also how I'm able to do these other projects, because I can apply for grants and things that help fund the work that I do there. But for a long time, I was teaching there, and I just sort of thought of it as something I almost did on the side. Like I was doing my client work, or I was doing my research work, and I just like, also taught classes. But at a certain point, I like really tried to commit to the graphic design program and to the students and the curriculum. Students are great there. I wanted to think about like the spaces we used, and we sort of reconfigured our spaces. This is what it looked like when I first started at Wayne. And then we kind of like opened up this room. There was this room that just had like computers all around the edges, and the windows were always blocked. And then we turned that into this like open space. But I found this work to be difficult because it was like, it sometimes feels like this like Sisyphean task where we would roll up our sleeves, clean the rooms. In this case, we got some used furniture. We made the spaces better. We revised the curriculum, but then it's all really hard to maintain because at Wayne State, the custodians are understaffed. The IT is understaffed. We, the faculty, are understaffed. And Wayne State, like so many public universities across the country, gets less and less state funding every year. Student tuition, meanwhile, is going up every year. So students are taking on debt. Adjunct faculty are underpaid. The building facilities are in bad shape, and it feels like the whole calculus is off. So over the last few years, I became increasingly involved in the union as much as I could. And then when COVID hit, I started going to meetings of the Coalition of Unions on campus, which includes unions representing IT staff, custodians, dining workers, grad student workers, adjuncts, the trades. And we advocated for like PPE for the janitors cleaning the dorms, and supported building engineers when they were trying to get attention for their understaffing. And then in February 2021, a number of IT staff were laid off, including the person who worked most closely with us in graphic design. And we organized a town hall to advocate against the layoffs. And those still happened, but this was one of the first times in a long time that workers, or first time since I've been there, that workers and students from all across campus came together on an issue. So around this time last year, I decided to run for president of the union. And I was definitely not an obvious choice for a person to run for this seat. The incumbent was a professor of political science who had been leading the union for 30 years. And I definitely felt like, still feel like imposter syndrome, because especially within the context of like a large research university, I feel like graphic design is just totally random. Like we're kind of off in a corner. But I ended up winning the election, and I took office in September. And it's been a massive learning curve. The bargaining unit includes 1,700 faculty and academic staff in 13 colleges and schools, from like medicine, law, nursing. And there's also academic staff like librarians, mental health counselors, advisors, coaches. And I've had to learn about like medicine, like medical education, labor law, like how to wade through financial information. But, it's also been very rewarding. Like Wayne State is one of the major employers in the city of Detroit. So it does feel like it's like there's, political potential in this space. But then also, been thinking sort of like in larger terms about higher education overall. There are all these tiers of workers within higher education. You have tenured and tenure track faculty and then you have like non-tenure track full-time faculty. We have adjunct faculty, you have graduate workers. There's extreme income inequality within the university. Like the president of my university makes over $1 million a year, is one of the highest paid public university administrators. But then you also have this weird thing where you have like some of the strongest job security that exists for tenured faculty, including myself. I have a job for life. I have academic freedom to research whatever I think needs researching, like the Detroit Printing Co-op, without any fear of political retribution. But then I work alongside people who have zero job security, like adjuncts who are precarious laborers. They are hired to teach a class. The starting pay is like $3,250 for a class. Sometimes they're asked to come teach on a couple of days' notice. There's no guarantee they'll have a class the next semester. There's definitely no benefits. So it's a extremely unequal environment. And so we become kind of each other's bosses, and it pits us against one another. I'm exactly occupying the space of the professional managerial class as a tenured professor. But meanwhile, none of this is really good for the students, obviously. And the thing about being at a public university is that we don't generate profit. We're not making cars or designing anything, or we're not making cars or like products. But there's still definitely a transfer of wealth happening, in the sense that, like, if there's less money coming in from the state, it means that taxes are lower for the residents of Michigan. And then when you put less Michigan tax money into Wayne State, rich Michiganders, might be happier. But then on the flip side, a school like Wayne State is like a public urban university that's serving people in Detroit. And as you starve the university, administrators have to look for more ways to save money and like cut costs, pay people less. You keep adding a couple more students to a class every semester, kind of increasing the class sizes. You don't hire custodians, things like that. And then tuition goes up every year. So you're taking more from young people who then take on debt, and then parts of the university become privatized. For instance, we have new campus housing that's like a public-private partnership, and the university takes on enormous debt. So there's a movement in labor to bargain for the common good, quote, bargain for the common good. So normally unions would focus on bargaining for bread and butter issues like wages, hours, working conditions for their workers. But the idea of bargaining for the common good got a lot of attention when the Chicago teachers went on strike in 2012. And they used their union power to kind of expand what they were asking for. So things like a nurse in every school building, or centering racial justice by making demands that address the role that employers play in creating and exacerbating structural racism in their communities, in our communities. So it's not an easy thing to do, but it's something, kind of to aspire to. But so I will just say, it's, as a graphic design person coming from graphic design, like from time to time, I'm like, how has my graphic design background really prepared me for this work? And it has, in the sense that it's about like communication, or figuring out, a lot of times you have to figure out how to communicate an idea and like convince people to do something. And so sometimes I'll have to make like a keynote presentation or a slide deck to put something across. But there's other ways in which I'm like, wow, this is really far from what I was doing before. But I just want to, I think the idea of organizing where you are and is important, and like committing to your workplace. So there's no such thing like as a union of graphic designers, but there are a lot of unions that graphic designers can be a part of and should be a part of. For instance, a lot of adjunct faculty are unionized now. This is just some images from adjunct faculty at AIGA in Baltimore who are fighting for higher wages. Something like 75% of classes in higher education across the country are taught by untenured faculty. And we should really be increasing the number of tenured jobs on our campuses and finding paths to tenure for untenured faculty. Adjunct and art workers at the Art Institute of Chicago formed a new union this year. And this was exciting because it was like adjunct instructors together with art workers. And then faculty at the Royal College of Art in London went on strike last year with some really beautiful graphics. I was just following this mostly on Twitter, but they were fighting precarity in teaching. So, but obviously there's a graphic designer behind all of these, from the way all of this looks. So I'll just close with this quote, which hopefully is not too heavy-handed. This is a quote from Marx. the workers have to put their heads together and as a class compel the passing of a law, an all-powerful social barrier by which they can be prevented from selling themselves and their families into slavery and death by voluntary contract with capital. So this is maybe a little heavy-handed, but the point is, you know, in order to kind of effect mass change, we need to figure out how to work together and put our heads together as a class. And, you know, maybe that means as graphic designers or as workers, wherever we are. So that's everything I have. I will stop sharing and maybe we can open it up for any kind of questions or discussion. I'm actually not sure if I'm able to stop sharing, but I will try. I have a new share. Here we go. Okay.
All right, thank you so much, Danielle. That was really amazing. And I've got like several questions, but I'm gonna hold off and see if anybody has one in there. And we could just sit through a little bit of an awkward silence.
Yeah. Also, as I was talking, I was like, this is kind of going all around to a lot of places, but it's complicated questions. Oh yeah, you can, people can unmute themselves and just feel free to speak or raise, yeah.
Hi. That was such an amazing talk. I kind of ended up here on like a bit of a weird link chain lark, and I was like, oh, this sounds great. And I just showed up here. I'm from Vancouver, Canada right now, and I teach at Emily Carr University of Art and Design. And we're actually just about to enter bargaining this spring. So this feels very appropriate. But one of the conversations that we were literally just having like 30 minutes ago as we sort of prepare for bargaining was sort of like, how do we kind of like bring together kind of all the unions that are on campus of faculty, staff, and custodial and kind of students and sort of build solidarity, even though there's a lot of different priorities amongst those groups and discrepancies in those groups. So faculty fighting for higher wages is really different from staff who make significantly less. So building solidarity of that. And then also kind of like how much do we try to get the public on our side and the public perception? And I thought that this class of kind of professional managerial exists in this weird space where it feels that even though there's maybe a lot of momentum behind unions right now, it feels harder maybe with this particular group of people. So just interested in your perspective on that, or the ways that you've run into that maybe and dealt with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, on our campus, we had this sort of existing coalition because we're in Detroit and Detroit is like a union town. I mean, every town says they're a union town when they're out on strike, but like, I feel like Detroit really is a, union town. So there's like 14 unions at Wayne State. It's like wall-to-wall unions, but this coalition has been in place for a long time. But I was just gonna, one thought I had is actually when I was looking at the Walker Worker Union website, I was like, oh, I kind of envy the newness of the union because I like a lot of the language on the website, and I'm in like a legacy union that's been around for 50 years, so it's been there forever. So the coalition has also been there forever, which is like pros and cons because the infrastructure is there, but then a con is that it's just like set in its ways. And so then, and it, like every meeting follows Robert's Rules of Order, which is like very strict way of running meetings. And it feels like people have their different roles that they play there, but we are often conscious of being like the biggest union and and trying not to be the biggest, the loudest voice in the room, because the faculty, like the professors, can kind of take over a little bit. But I also think, working across job categories is like critical because if the coalition is in agreement on things and you want to stop, shut down the university, you really can. On the other hand, it is hard to find agreement. So like one of the campaigns we've been working on is around like broken elevators on campus, which doesn't seem like it's that exciting, but it's something that affects everyone, including the students. And so people have started to kind of come together around that. And I feel like it's true. There's like a lot of support for unions right now, and then the definition of the worker is changing. People are starting to recognize that it's changing. And I think that, I mean, in my experience, a lot of the people are just like happy to have more engagement. I don't feel like people are saying like, you're not an auto worker, so therefore you're not like a real union person. I feel like people are just happy to have more energy and more kind of, people thinking about these problems. It's not really an answer, but I kind of get the question and the challenges.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I feel like it's just sort of things we work through, but it's just really exciting to see the ways that you're approaching it here.
I mean, I will say it's very stressful because our website is terrible. I shouldn't say that too loudly, but it's like as a designer in this role, I'm stressed about not being able to take care of the design issues that are very urgent, because I'm in a bargaining unit with like there's 1,700 people, but only 3 of us are graphic designers. and so I feel like we really need more graphic design help. But also I don't have time to do it.
I found it really interesting the way you described how leftist culture has been potentially suspicious of graphic design in the past, because graphic design can feel, if it's too polished, it can feel like it's commodifying something. And at the same time, I'm seeing a lot of these new unionization efforts that some of them, like the Royal College of Art, are like coming out, and the Walker one are actually coming out with very kind of beautiful design languages as well. And then that makes me think of also like when I see like social movements and protests on the street, often what I see is more like non-design design elements that become popular and turn into memes, whether it's like a t-shirt designed by a non-designer. And those things seem to have a lot of power that I'm curious whether a designer could sit down and capture that power. So I'm just curious, like when you, because you've pointed to sort of different union efforts that you're seeing, and it's out, and you care about the quality of the design work for your efforts as well. So I'm curious, like how your definition of quality or like success has changed when you're designing for these kinds of efforts.
Yeah, I think, well, like that poster we made for my friend Sean, who's like the auto worker, it was like, does that, I hesitate to even say it was designed, it was like we made it in like 15 minutes and then just got it printed. But I feel like the like success is that you can read it from a distance or something, it's like straightforward. But I feel like the Royal College of Art stuff looks amazing. I don't actually know who designed that, and I was trying to find out before tonight, but I didn't find out. But I think that like that stuff really helps. I mean, all of the same tools that make you want to buy something also make you want to join the union. This is a point that I was talking about with somebody else the other day, but it's like those same tools that, capitalism uses to sell you stuff can also be used for the movement. And I think that people's perceptions are shifting. It was actually like Indy Pressman who was talking about how when he was trying to design stuff for like Dissent magazine, at first they were like, no, we don't want it to look consumerist. But I've definitely noticed a shift even in the last like 5 years with that, because I think, I don't know if it's like younger people, but people just recognize that the way information is communicated helps convince people, and it also just like explains things for people. I mean, I think we just have so much information coming at us that like if you can design some complicated ideas, into sort of simpler ideas, it helps. I also like had this weird experience a couple months ago where it was in January. So like, 2 months ago, I designed this like keynote, like the slide deck around salaries in the School of Medicine. to show how people's salaries were being cut. And it was like surprisingly effective. It was a very simple keynote, but they backed off. The administration backed off cutting the salaries, because I think once we presented our narrative and we're like, this is what we see happening, they were like, oh, if you put it that way. And I was like, wow, keynote really helped.
I was also curious when you mentioned you didn't want to centralize the design efforts within this giant union and sort of replicate this like in-house studio model. Could you expand upon what you were proposing as
Oh,
the
yeah.
alternative?
So like that was in the DSA. So maybe this is sort of like, well, this is the question is, can you have like a socialist way of making work that's different from just the way we make work? I mean, graphic design as a whole profession is sort of, as a field, comes out of certain needs that are like, needs that exist within, capitalism. So in that group, we were like, okay, if this is a socialist group, what does socialist graphic design methods look like? And so I felt like I like the idea of graphic designers having more agency. And sometimes I feel like graphic designers, when you're in that role where you're just like, tell me what you need and I'll make it for you, or I'll make you a few versions, you kind of give up some agency or kind of like being passive. So, but I thought ideally you have designers who are involved in like, the housing justice project or whatever, and helping to direct the whole campaign. And then they're making the graphics or whatever is necessary. And, because some of the things people were talking about were like, we should have like a Google form where you could say like, I need a postcard that's 4x6 with this and that. And I like the idea of the graphic designer as the author, or the graphic designer being just like embedded, because this is also just as a model, like this is also like Emory Douglas and the Black Panthers. Emory Douglas was in the Panthers. He has the politics. He's making the newspaper. He's making the graphics. It's not like someone's like, hey, can you make a poster of a woman, who's complaining about her rent or whatever. I mean, he knew what was coming up. Somebody had like come off the screen for a minute. I just want to make sure. I don't know if but people can also, you can like raise your hand or you can just speak. But yeah,
there is another question in the chat. I just quickly wanted to mention the idea of, and I know you weren't sort of positioning in-house studios versus embedded designers in any particular way, but I do think this idea of an embedded in-house studio that can sort of respond to what is happening with agency and understands the larger organization that they're working within could be super effective.
Yeah, no, and I also felt like I had my own like weird relationship as a design, like my ideas about how things should be, but it was totally impractical. For I don't know, it didn't really make sense.
So I've got a question here from Michael that says, you mentioned that there is no union for graphic designers. I've heard this a few times over the last 20 years or so. What barriers do you think there are to bring one into existence, and how do you see those barriers being overcome?
Well, I don't know, sometimes I had this fantasy that you could have a union, if you could have a union for graphic designers in the way that the International Typographical Union existed, although this really wouldn't work. But the International Typographical Union was a union that was like, I forget the name for this type of union, but like the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers is this type of union too, where you have like an apprentice system and you belong to a local and then you get hired out to do different jobs. So like if they're making buildings at Wayne State, they would hire people from IBEW to do those jobs, and it's like union labor. But those workers are not employees of Wayne State. They're like union members, and then they get hourly wages that are negotiated through their union contract. So that's a kind of model that I feel like could work for graphic design, maybe. But then you'd have to change the whole culture of like clients to be like, I'm going to work with union labor. And then like the AIGA is a professional organization. That's different. Graphic Artists Guild. Yeah, I feel like the Graphic Artists Guild, yeah, it's sort of that idea, but it's not really. Does it, maybe, I don't know if anybody else knows more about the graphic artists. There is actually a graphic design union, and maybe that's it, because but I don't know that it really, has worked as effectively. And one of the things is that, of course, you just have so many, I don't know, so much distributed labor. There's no single boss, really. It's not like when you're making a building, it's a major project and you kind of hire people. It's very easy to hire people for like piecework, like
Got another question. Are there a lot of socialists or communists in the Wayne State Union?
Maybe there could be more. It would be nice if there. I mean, I think one of the other things that I've been, hello, Tuan. I feel like one of the other things that has been challenging is, or interesting, is learning how to work with large groups of people, or like how to move large groups of people. Like when you have a big group and some people are like ready to go to the barricades, like they're like militant, ready to go. And then you have others who are like more reticent and they don't really want to fight. Like, how do you bring everybody together? Like, do you push at the front, or do you try to get everybody on board? And this is sort of new for me a little bit. Trying to think about this, like when are you being like too radical, or when are you not being radical enough? Hi, Maya. Maya was the reader on the first recording of the Dispossessed chapter. So do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. I haven't looked at myself, so
yeah.
I'm just curious about like your experience since you've become president of the union, whether you've seen a shift in sort of the culture that was existing there before, or just what your experience has been like since you've transitioned into the role.
Yeah, it's been crazy. Like sometimes I think I accidentally like changed careers without really thinking about it. And I mean, it's not been a year yet, but it's just been like a huge learning curve. Like, I don't know, like also learning how to do kind of politics and that type of stuff has been weird. But we're trying to change the culture of the union, because it's like I said, it's like this 50-year-old union. So it's definitely feeling different now. But, you look at things like the Chicago Teachers Union and you're like, oh, how do they do that? So much, it'd be amazing to be able to do stuff like that. But it's also been, I'm hoping that after a year, things will kind of settle down and I'll know how things work, and I don't know, I can sort of take a step back a little bit. But it really does feel like, not to be a total downer, but it really does feel like public higher education is in a serious crisis nationally. You definitely feel it at Wayne State. We're like, I'm wondering, are we going to survive the pandemic? Is everything going to be okay? I don't know if other people are feeling that in your industry, in other industries, but definitely feels that way in higher ed, or public higher ed specifically.
I'm curious, how do these ideas make their way into your teaching? And is it just like an inherently contradictory sort of practice to be teaching both sides of the graphic design profession?
Yeah, well, yeah, so I actually, I teach history of graphic design. So I get a course release for doing the president work. So that means I'm just teaching one class a semester. So I'm teaching history of graphic design, and I actually teach a couple of lectures, or I do a couple of lectures on the history of labor and in design. So like the history of the International Typographical Union and that kind of thing. And I try to talk about labor as it relates to design. I mean, and the other thing is I also try to like thematize, I guess, the situation that the students are in, like with their loans, or the fact that a lot of them are working 2 or 3 jobs, you know, while they're in school. But then I really feel like it's also important to teach students like skills, like actual skills that they can use, you know, on the job market. But we just talk about it, you know, we're like, you know, sort of like those quotes from Freddie Perlman, where I'm like, yeah, it's like we are preparing them to like go into the labor market and be cogs of the machine, but I want to make sure that they can be cogs of the machine and it's their choice, you know, and they can go in and then, you know, do that work, but hopefully be also, you know, critical at the same time. Oh, and then, okay, I see Andy's question in the chat about how do you feel about the idea of design studios transitioning towards a more worker-owned cooperative model? How do we breathe more life into that idea here in Detroit? Yeah, so I think the co-op model is definitely, you know, interesting, because I feel like a lot of studios are in a situation where you're small enough, you can kind of adapt a co-op model. And I mean, all that really means is that you don't have, you know, hierarchy in your studio, or it can mean different things, but it basically means that you have shared ownership and you share decision-making, and Partner and Partners in New York is like a really good example of that right now. And then in Detroit, I think Small Works is a co-op model. And then Lauren Williams has also been working on a co-op, like a kind of an artist run co-op. I mean, and I think that, you know, it's hard to do, but I feel like, but I do think that's a good model, you know, for small scale designers to adopt. And I remember talking to somebody I knew who belonged to a craft co-op that had been going on since the 70s. And she was like, I just don't understand why more people are not in craft co-ops, like in co-ops. This is a good model. Everybody pools their resources, you make decisions together, you share the, you know, the revenues or whatever. So I think people just don't know how to do it. It's just figuring out how to do it.
I have one last question that I will allow myself to ask, and that's about it's a big question about the pandemic. So in your presentation, it sounded like, well, it sounded like during the pandemic, you were able to meet with like all of the different unions collectively. And I'm curious, like, what other impact did the pandemic have for you personally in terms of your profession, but also in terms of your understanding of labor, and what do you think the impact is on union movements as well? And that's a very large question, but feel free to answer that in a personal way.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of like everything. Like I was thinking about this talk tonight being, you know, on Zoom instead of in person. And I think it's similar for like the organizing work and the labor work. Like it's definitely better when you're in person because of all the conversations you're having like before and after the event. You know, and so with the union work, more people can participate, obviously, because things are on Zoom. So more people can come to things. Like one concrete thing is the School of Medicine has become more involved. Like at Wayne State, they're kind of on 2 separate campuses, and the medical school represents like half of the revenue coming into the or like half of the budget of the university. It's a ton of people, but they're like totally separate from main campus. They belong to our union, but I think in general, they feel like the union is like useless. Like they don't really understand what it is. But during the pandemic, they started coming on calls, and then we had this issue, their salaries were going to be cut. And they became really active. And it was all these people that like I'd never met, but they also were doing union work like for the first time. So that's been really great. And maybe in a way, the doctors or like the physicians are kind of good on Zoom because they tend to be very pragmatic. Like they just want an agenda. Like we're meeting for 1 hour and we're not gonna just like talk at random about things. Everything has to be kind of like useful. Whereas with some of the coalition calls go for like 2 hours. And like it's like dining workers, custodial staff, engineers, and people just will come on randomly like half an hour into the call, like on their phone, and then like leave at half an hour early or whatever. So it feels like it's like more like a fluid meeting, where we're just all talking about our problems from our points of view. So I feel like those calls, probably people are also joining more because it's on Zoom. But what we don't get is like all the in-between calls where like there's, or all the in-between conversations that I think are useful for building like solidarity and that type of thing. But it definitely was sort of surreal to like run for this president, like all online. Not really knowing when the campus was going to reopen. But yeah, so I don't know. And then now we're in that weird space where things are starting to go back in person. So I don't know how it's all gonna kind of shake out, we'll see. It's not really I'm ready for it to be over though. That's all.
I wanted to hear that you had started baking bread or something like that.
Oh yeah. No, I did start actually listening to music a lot more, like listening to Spotify. So I have like a whole playlist for my history class. So the Bauhaus song is it's from the day that I do Bauhaus. Has like nothing to do with actual Bauhaus except the name. But
okay, well, I think we're out of time. Unless there's one more question, I'll leave it open for a few seconds. Somebody's dying to ask a question. No, it looks like we're good. So thank you so much, Danielle. That was amazing. I think you've given us a lot to think about. I'm going to dig into this. This presentation will be archived on the Walker's YouTube site as well. And I know I'm going to go back and look at a lot of those reference points that you brought up and dig into those. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for coming, everybody. It's good to see you all.
Yep.
I mean,
Thanks,
not
everybody.
really see you all, but